Ready.
Hello, I'm Monica Rolliter, and welcome to the first episode of On Air, a new webinar series from AirPop that puts a spotlight on the primacy and urgency of breathing well. In honor of Earth Day 2021, the first episode, which is titled Our Relationship with the Air Around Us, tackles the very real problem of air pollution, including how it impacts our health and why it's important to be informed and take ownership of the air we breathe. First, I'd like to introduce each of our esteemed panelists, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. First, please meet Chris Hosmer, product designer and co-founder of AirPop. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, thanks. I co-founded AirPop in 2015 with my business partner, Jet Fu. I am a product designer, and I was a frustrated parent at the time. And what spurred the founding of the company was that my daughter had an acute reaction to the air pollution when we were living in China. So we set out to learn about all the things we didn't know about. And one of those things turned out to be that most masks on the market are awful products, don't work for a lot of people. So we thought, perfect opportunity to innovate, and that's what we did.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thanks for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Nick Davenport, who is the founder of Lanaco and a materials applications engineer. Nick, welcome, and tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Hi, as you said, my name is Nick Davenport. I'm the founder and managing director of Lanaco. This is a company that I set up about 10 years ago, as the previous company I had founded was a synthetic polymers-based materials company supplying products to every type of manufactured good. And in that time, we were manufacturing filters from polyester fibers. I'm from New Zealand, and in New Zealand, we have a agricultural-based economy where we have a lot of sheep. Traditionally, we had about 50 million. Now we're 5 million people with 25 million sheep. And those animals produce a wonderful fiber called wool. And as a New Zealander, and a science and a materials-based person, I thought, well, what if we could do something with this fiber? And the more I dug, the more I found out that it actually could create the world's best respiratory filter media. And that was its really best spot, was looking after people. And so that started quite a long journey. Making air filter media, which is a precision product with high performance standards from an animal product, is quite difficult. So we actually set about by creating a breed. We bred to an objective to make our sheep, which we call our little white extruders, extrude the fiber to the performance to optimize respiratory filtration. And so here we are in 2021, where we grow fiber on a farm, process it, and produce filter media, and even now N95 face masks to protect people's health.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. It's great to meet you. And our third panelist is Louie Cheng, president and founder of Pure Living. Louie, thanks for joining us. I know it's early your time. Can you tell us about your background, please?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Louie Cheng from Pure Living. I originally came from the US, but kind of like Chris, I came over to China about 15 years ago. And then when I first came to China, there were not a lot of options when it came to determining if your indoor environment was safe, if your home was safe, your school was safe. So I had actually been a nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare defense officer in the Army. So I had a background that was applicable to coming over and assessing and defending against airborne pollutants, and kind of put that together in 2010. That started as an environmental consultancy to help assess. Then we would make reports, but very quickly we found out the market was asking us to do more than that. Fix the problem, don't just give me advice. So we very quickly ended up being end-to-end, creating our own intellectual property, our own technologies. So today, about, I guess, 11 years ago, 11 years later, we do everything from testing, consultancy, system design, R&D, installation, and most importantly, now we do monitoring so that we actually measure continuously how your environment is, and we keep it healthy that way.
Great.
I'm going to add a personal note here that it was 10 years ago in 2011 at my previous company. We just built out a new office in Shanghai, and some of our people were feeling sick. And I first got in touch with Louie back then, and his company came in, did an assessment of our office. Turns out, very common problem, high levels of formaldehyde and some other things. We had a couple pregnant people in the office, and that experience really stayed with me. And that's something that I kind of brought forward into AirPop years later, combined with some of the experience I had in my past. I had designed air purifiers previously. So I knew a little something about air quality, but really kind of being confronted with that in a personal way when I got to China was it really made a big impact. So we go that far back, Louie and I.
Yeah, that was right. That was a long time ago.
Awesome. Well, thanks to all of you for your introductions and backgrounds. Can't wait to dig into our topic of the day, specifically air pollution. As we know, it's a very big problem that impacts our world every day. There's the number lately is that 8.7 million people globally die every year from air pollution. So let's dive in. Chris, let's start with you. What can you dig into what air pollution is, how it's created, and why is it so dangerous to our health?
Yeah, right. I mean, air pollution is one of these things that it's really difficult to talk about because it's invisible. And so a lot of people don't have a sort of a mental model for it. Usually you care about things that you can see, things that you can sense. Air pollution is one of the most insidious threats to global health because it is invisible. And right now, like you said, the World Health Organization has estimated that over 8 million people a year are dying as a cause of air pollution, which is really staggering to think about. So the welfare fallout costs of persistent ambient air pollution, that's just what we can measure. So the number is likely many multiples higher than that. But I first got interested in this as like I said, in a kind of a personal way, because I had a health scare in my family. And when I started looking into it, I realized that the science around what we could measure in our air was advancing pretty rapidly. So we were able to sense and detect and monitor a lot of things kind of compositionally now. But what hadn't happened was the science around sort of air sensing or monitoring hadn't really crossed with the body of science and medicine around internal health, meaning that the effects of air pollution in the body is still a very nascent kind of area of inquiry, like scientifically. And so when my daughter got sick, it was very frustrating as a parent because we'd ask doctors what was wrong with her. She was getting bronchitis a lot. She was getting infant pneumonia, things that really shouldn't be happening as often as they were. And all we got back was, well, could be the air, but it could be a bunch of other things. We don't know. It's best if you change your environment and see if it continues. So, that just really pissed me off, frankly, that we couldn't get a straight answer. Ultimately, we did change her environment and it did improve. And that was a big aha. So, we thought, well, there's like 1 billion other people that can't just leave the country. What can be done? And so when we started looking into, wearable protective products and really looking at the category, we realized that air pollution isn't any one thing. It's many thousands of different things, all of them invisible. But you can, in fact, think about it as kind of three basic things. And so the mental model that I've been working on, and I tell people, is there's kind of three different threat types that you need to be aware of. One of them is anthropogenic. So that is any kind of human-made pollutant. And a lot of times that is, and Louie can probably talk a lot about this, it's any kind of combustible byproduct. So like a carbon combustion, auto emission, factory emission, that creates a very fine type of particulate. It's particularly dangerous when it's inhaled because it crosses into your bloodstream, and it affects your entire circulatory system, all your organ systems. It can even cross the blood-brain barrier. That's really, really not good. The second threat type, is more ecologic. So this is anything naturally occurring in the environment. Here in California, we have wildfire season now twice a year. So smoke from fire would be an example. Dust storms, even pollen or airborne allergens would count. And then the third type is what we experienced just this last year, which is pathogenic threats. And those are things like airborne transmissible viruses like seasonal influenza and COVID. So from the very beginning, we knew with AirPop we wanted to create a protection posture and an approach that was as broad as possible and addressed all three of those threat types. But that's something that I think is a starting point. Not enough people sort of understand, and I think it's going to continue to be really dangerous for a lot of the world's population because it is something that is unseen and sort of untalked about.
Yes. Well, let's jump into Louie, because you mentioned Louie talking about, obviously, this, what you mentioned, Chris, is a lot of what's outside, that pollutants that are affecting us from an outdoor perspective. Louie, because you focus on the indoor space and inside, what are some common pollutions to be watching for at home or at work in the air that can be dangerous to our respiratory health?
It has a lot to do with what is the environment or where do you live. So for instance, my background and the reason I started the company was because we were in an area in North Asia, which pretty much seasonally, it's much worse in the winter, but it's also high year round, where there is an outdoor particulate pollution source, which is it comes from industrial, from vehicles, sometimes natural, from sandstorms. There are meteorological reasons why sometimes the haze is very high. We don't have wildfires, but we're starting. I mean, we see that this is not just a China problem. It's not just an India problem. This is a worldwide problem. I think in London, last year, there was the first small girl, very sad, was the first one to be diagnosed as the official cause of death was air pollution. So we have outdoor pollution sources, but we also have indoor pollution sources in China and in some of the other more fast-growing economies. You have a very fast cycle of fit outs and construction. The construction is going to use a lot of manufactured materials, paints, resins, and these are chemicals that are volatile organic compounds. Basically, they change state from either a liquid to a gas or a solid to gas when they encounter pressure, temperature, humidity, and then we breathe these in. So these are the ones where, whereas particulates might lead to respiratory issues, a lot of the VOCs will lead to allergic reactions, skin, but also neurological long-term problems as well. So we look at the outdoor PM pollution, we look at a lot of the indoor chemical pollution, and the last one, besides the obvious COVID, or even flu season bacterial, is from carbon dioxide. So CO2 is one that probably most people don't think about. But anyone who's been in a small classroom or a meeting room, remember the last time you were sitting in the meeting room with 6 people and you couldn't keep your eyes open. Didn't matter what you were talking about. You're feeling uncomfortable, it's sweaty, you smell the guy next to you, and you just open that door and it feels much better. That's the impact of CO2. There's no unusual pollution source, but it's us. We are the source of pollution. So I'll talk about fixes later, but those tend to be the sort of 4 classes of pollutants that we find indoors. Outdoor particulates. If you're in India, it could also be outdoor chemicals or odors. Indoor VOCs from often man-made materials. Third would be pathogenic, so bacterial, viral. And then the fourth might be CO2 from generally people.
Thank you. Very informative. Well, I guess because of these different dangers to our lungs and our body, we want to protect ourselves, right, from these pollutants. For Nick, because you work in this space of creating products that can protect us, how do you think about solving the issue of protecting people from harmful air without contributing to the problem of creating more waste in the production of PPE products? And as we are talking during Earth Day and on Earth Day, how can PPE become a sustainable endeavor to protect all of us from these indoor and outdoor pollutants?
Thanks. That's the most appropriate question right at the moment when the world is facing an ecological tsunami of waste PPE products coming from personal disposed devices, which is going to be in the ground, landfill, or having to be burnt. It's just terrible. That was never on the table when we first came up with the idea of how can we create a future filtration media which doesn't contribute, as you said, to the problem that it's trying to solve, either in its creation, its manufacture, its use, or its disposal. And I think we've come up with that answer, is using natural materials which work to protect humans and even more. And the great thing about this sort of opportunity that we face and we can present to the world is a platform that solves all of the problems and brings additional benefits. When I say additional benefits, just pick up on what Louie said about internal pollutants. The outgassing of paints and resins and floor coatings and formaldehyde alone is highly toxic. So we've got a fiber as a core ingredient that actually makes formaldehyde inert. It absorbs it better and converts it in a way that activated charcoal systems currently do not. So these are incredible things that we're finding out about this as a future solution to the air quality. Either if it's outdoors, where if you're filtering air through into your automobile or into a bus, if you're wearing a device, and then, or if you're inside in your home, or if this filter is in your appliance, because we've got no choice about the air. Everybody that's not breathing is no longer around. So it's the universal global problem that just won't go away, no matter what. And as Chris has said, all these different sources, and you have to protect yourself against aerosols and gases. And if you've got a platform that's better for the earth in all respects, but also looks after the people, that's the answer.
I think one thing I wanted to add in that kind of stitches what Nick and Louie were just saying is that one thing we don't talk about is, as Louie mentioned, is the carbon dioxide. And that's also something that every living thing either uses or produces. And it matters in the context of masking, because a lot of times when you're wearing a face covering, as opposed to a respirator or a medical mask, that face covering a lot of times is a really crappy experience. It feels hot and wet and oppressive. part of the sensory experience is that you're recycling that carbon dioxide. It's not diffusing at the proper rate. And so you end up re-inhaling some of that. You get that sort of foggy brain feeling. And what Nick's company is doing, what AirPop has been doing, is really looking at creating a profile for those filters and those masks to stand off the face to allow that proper diffusion. That's something that a lot of the mask brands that have sprouted up in the last year sort of fail to recognize, is that on the experiential front, carbon dioxide is one of the things that make the experience feel bad. And so we have to design for that. So I just wanted to jump in on that, because it's something when we talk about pollutants and contaminants, we don't tend to talk a lot about carbon dioxide, but it is something that's, it's in everyone.
Oh, look, I pick up on that one as well, because that's a function of airflow resistance. So you put anything over your face, or you put any filter in front of a fan on any device. If the airflow resistance is high, that's the problem. That's the next problem that you're facing. So low airflow resistance is the holy grail. And if you can create airflow resistance at the lowest possible level, you increase comfort, you reduce carbon dioxide. If you can manage the moisture as well, the temperature effect for a face mask, for example, or you can make it work better in an external or an interior environment, those are advantages as well. So that's an area that's a very strong focus for us, not just to ensure that we can remove the aerosols, the PM, and the volatiles, but we can also do it in a very, very efficient way. And that's I think is the answer. And it means you can use less material, which is less waste. There are so many advantages.
It's funny that what you guys are talking about with personal wearable masks is exactly the same thing that we're working on with buildings. So to give an example of this, typically a building is serviced by a HVAC system, which is heating, ventilation, air conditioning. Those are the mechanical systems, the lungs of a building. Yes. And now if we want to, very early on in China, we figured that we need to bring in the air. Otherwise, your alternative is opening windows, which gives you no filtration. So you want to bring in the air mechanically, but you need to filter it. And the filters that were used were typically 100 years, maybe actually it was in the 50s where you first had HEPA filters come out in a standardized way. But you would put those on a building, and now you're bringing in millions of cubic feet of air, and it's being pushed through a very, very restrictive filter. So just as your body would have a hard time breathing and pushing that through, the same thing is happening with blowers, which are motors using electricity to push air through restrictive filters, and that costs a lot. So when people say green, they typically talk about our industry. They say, "Oh, you do air quality. Well, that's green. Good on you." But when you think about it, one of those guilty realizations I had early on was that we're actually very non-green when it comes to sustainability for energy. And what happens to these HEPA filters? They don't get recycled because of the nature of them. They can't be washed. They're thrown away. But we've been working more and more to try to find ways around that. So I had a school that I visited recently, one of the school leaders in Beijing, and they have on days where it's 300 micrograms outside. To give you an example, that's the 24-hour standard for the WHO is 25 micrograms. So 300 microgram day on Beijing is kind of a bad winter day, and they are able to achieve under 5 consistently. So that's a very, very, very good performance, but it comes at a very high cost. They also choose to leave it on 24/7, which to me is a very sort of unnecessary step. So there's a lot that can be done to both achieve health, but to do it in a responsible way, whether it's through operations, whether it's through using new media, whether it's through tightening up your building, for instance, or maybe just accepting that you're balancing. It doesn't make sense that you demand as a parent of a student going to a school that they have 0 or less than 2 micrograms, when they're then going to leave that building and be in a 300 microgram open environment, and then they'll go home and you don't really care that much at home, and now they're in a 50 microgram environment. So it's all about dose and exposure. And yeah, looks like Nick, you got something to jump in there.
Oh, look, yeah, absolutely, totally agree. And it's a really thing, we call it the paradox of nines. So people who go for 99.9% of reduction, they never ever achieve it. If it's in a face mask, it's going to leak. If it's in your home, the air is going to come in under the door. Yeah, unless it's an AirPop. Or you've got to have a huge amount of surface area. So, but just think about this: for if every apartment was trying to protect, every apartment was trying to in the world was trying to protect people from outdoor air pollution, how many power stations it would take to power those number of air purifiers? And if you could make a reduction in energy of those air purifiers by having a more efficient filter, then that's a solution as well. And then if that pre-filter was a sustainable, renewable, compostable material which contributed to the environment rather than harmed it, that's another solution for Earth Day.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. I do want to kind of go back to the dangers of air pollution. We didn't really get into how does that impact a person's health? I think most people think it affects the lungs first and foremost, or mainly, but is that true? Because like you said, Chris, we can't see this. So what is it doing potentially to our body that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, well, I think this is a key issue, and I mean, obviously, none of us are medical experts that I'm aware of, but the I think common sense understanding that I now have, that I think more people should have, is that air pollution is both a cause of disease states, and it's also an accelerant, or it exacerbates existing disease states. So the case that Louie had mentioned earlier about the 9-year-old girl, Ellie Adu Kissi Deborah in the UK, she lived in South London. She's the first person in the UK officially who had a cause of death of air pollution, which is staggering to think about it, because our conventional wisdom around particulate pollution in the body was that it was cumulative over a number of years. And so if you live in an area with even very low levels of air pollution, but it's persistent every day, that will, over the course of your life, take a certain number of years off the end of your life when you calculate it. But this was a 9-year-old girl. She'd only lived for 9 years. And the official cause was that air pollution was a material contributor to her death. So when you think about that, something else is going on. And the way that it's described to me by a number of doctors and epidemiologists is that a lot of these, particularly the particulate matter, this fine particulate matter, when it goes into the body and it goes into your arteries, it actually forms a sort of a plaque in there. And that if you are living in an area, and unfortunately this happens in heavily urbanized areas where there are highways or industrial zones, the people that are living in those areas are being exposed to disproportionately high amounts of airborne particulate. So they're getting this every day, and it is going into their organs, and it is going into their blood, and it is accelerating a lot of these disease states. So we do tend to think of it as like, breathing is lungs, so I need to protect my respiratory system. But it's actually not only your respiratory system you need to be worried about. It's your heart, it's your liver, it's your brain. All of these things are increasingly being proven scientifically to have to be impacted by exposure to air pollution.
Thank you. And I mean, thinking kind of long term, as we've mentioned, with the pandemic, more and more people are wearing masks to protect themselves from that airborne threat. But again, air pollution is extremely dangerous as well. So what do you think people are going to do going forward as far as wearing masks when it comes to protecting themselves? And just in general, how can people protect themselves from air pollution? This is a question for all of you, in whether they live in a big city or not, but how can they protect themselves?
Well, I mean, I'll just start. I do think, look, I mean, I think I get asked this all the time. Are masks here to stay? Are we going to have to wear masks forever now? What's the deal? And as much of a bummer as it is to have to think about that, I think we do have a responsibility to think about that. And I think, again, looking towards Asia as an example, there is a longstanding sort of culture of masking in East Asia, North Asia, for a few different reasons. One of which is the threats that are airborne, but one of them is also I'm half Japanese, and so in Japan there's a culture of courtesy masking, which is like, I might have a cold, I might be sick, I'm going to put a mask on to prevent me from infecting the people around me. So it's a sort of a preemptive, courteous act. And I do think that what we've seen over the last year is that the caseload for influenza at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 is way down, historically low, kind of unprecedentedly low flu season. And that's because of masking. More people were masking as a result of COVID. So I think that masks ultimately, are going to be a sort of an essential item, and I think the way it's going to work is that there's going to be masks are going to be kind of like wipes or Band-Aids or Kleenex, where they're not every day, but they're ubiquitous. And so you have one, there's one always at hand. There's one in your glove box. There's one in your backpack or purse. There's one in your desk drawer at the office. There's one in your bathroom cabinet. And that's just something that we're all going to kind of get used to, because these threats will become more prevalent and more awareness is happening. So I think the combination of those things means that, yeah, I think masks are probably here to stay.
Yeah, I think absolutely, Chris. One of the observations we've had over the last 12 months is, I guess there's been a huge amount of education for the non-mask wearers into what mask wearing is about, but also a lot of misinformation from governments and other sources about what you can use or shouldn't use. We were told early on that to use a coffee filter or vacuum cleaner bag. And I don't know if you've ever tried to breathe through one of those, but I'd rather stab myself in the eye with a pencil than do that. So that was official advice because there was no product available. So the messaging changed over time. So I think the education process is a big thing as a positive out of this for people to learn and to take the step of learning. We've observed recently, as we've gone into summer, a lot of mask wearing fatigue. And I've spoken to people that say, I just wear anything because I don't want to be rude. It's similar to the Japanese courtesy. I don't want to be seen as the person that's not wearing a mask. I don't care whether it works or not, but I will. So that's a bit of a negative thing that's come out of this process. And so therefore the education process about how people can look after each other by masking correctly or understanding what's in the air around them is really important. So I think we've got a collective responsibility to help spread that message about what it actually means. It's not just a courtesy thing. There's an immense function that needs to be addressed.
On my end, I would say this goes back to knowing the environment you're in. So I actually observed this in China on the street well before the pandemic, where people would wear masks. You would see them when I first started seeing them during the winter. I thought, this is great. We're making an impact. People are listening. But then you realize that a lot of the people just wear masks because it's cold. And when you start seeing the sophistication, I think where I started seeing that a little bit more is every once in a while I would be on a street corner and I would count the next 10 people that came by on a bad day. How many of those were wearing masks? And sometimes I saw it as high as like 7. So it meant 70% of people were wearing some kind of mask, presumably with some awareness. And that comes because it's the air quality monitoring outdoors was very ubiquitous in China. I think by it first started, you started seeing official government monitoring, and those numbers were made available through weather apps, personal apps by about 2014. And then since then, it's just continued from there. And now not just outdoor, but indoors as well. So as an individual, I think what you can do is you look for those sources of information, or you have your own app on your phone. At home, you have a monitor, which is telling you what your levels are, and it lets you adjust your behavior. So if you cook, you see the impact of that. If you do cleaning, you see the impact on your air, and you take the appropriate actions, whether you're indoors to use the right type of source, you address the source and remove that, or you introduce new fresh air and you dilute it, or you do filters. Then if you're outside, you wear masks as appropriate.
Great. That actually brings up my next question. I think part of all of this is education for consumers, right? And again, with the spotlight on masking, I think that will help as we talk about air pollution. But because air pollution is such a problem, what can we do, all of us citizens of the world, how can we help to reduce the pollution around us to help to reduce air pollution and that threat? This is a question for all of you.
Well, I can start and I'll tee up Nick on this one, but I think it's a demand and a supply problem. I think when you think about some of the main sources of air pollution, a lot of it does come down to energy, and the amount of energy, the types of energy that are used to produce the amount of stuff that we consume. I think it kind of is that simple. And so I tend to think of it as really taking individual responsibility and individual actions to kind of reduce our consumption. And unless we have a real kind of step change in the demand for new stuff and more stuff all the time, we're not really going to see that sort of attendant change on the supply side. Having said that, I do think what companies like Nick's are doing on the supply side, it is one of the answers, and it is really addressing utilization or clean breath hours as a starting point. So can we change those materials? Can we change those streams? Can we reduce net the waste that we're creating? Are there other solutions? And I think that's what's so interesting about what Nick's team is doing down in New Zealand is really looking at this problem on the end that not a lot of companies are, frankly.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, Chris. I guess my outlook is the world doesn't like the news that it's going to get from me, and it's going to get worse. Because as the third world lifts out of poverty and wants to be like the Western world with its consumption, it's very difficult to stop. So consumption of textiles, manufactured goods, motor vehicles, and the will and the desire for air travel, and just the things that we accept as the normal of our world are what cause the problem. And a growing population just makes it bigger, and the health problems we haven't even seen yet, because they have been a function of this more recent explosion of industrial consumption of products. So all we can do, I think, is create the right signals for people to say that there is a choice to consume less and make very informed decisions about the products that you choose. And is it going to consume more energy and therefore create another coal-fired power station somewhere else? Is it going to create more air pollution and water pollution, fibers in the waterways, plastics in the waterways, microparticles in the air, or dangerous aerosols? Make those conscious decisions, and rather than holding placards and telling the world that somebody has to do something, actually getting those people to do something themselves is the only answer in my view.
Back to buildings. I focus on buildings because if buildings obviously serve a lot of people, you have to have personal protection as well as a systematic building infrastructure change. The two of them work together to protect you. So with when it comes to HVAC, the very traditional means of filtration has been to use these high efficiency filters. But we're starting to see a lot of efficiencies possible. As an example, we have an approach that we use. It's sort of part engineering, part technology, but it's called smart HVAC upgrading. Basically, what it does is it takes instead of these high efficiency filters, we put in, let's say, a lower grade filter, but you also mix in electronic filters. So electronic filters were developed for high pollution factories, for instance, but they have newer ones that are that will allow air to come through. They charge a particle on one end, and then they have a negative charge that causes those particles to stick to a charged plate or charged tubes. Now, there's a downside to this. The upside is that it allows air to flow through that much more quickly without getting very engineer geeky. That means you can use a lot less energy to move the same amount of air at almost the same amount of particulate filtration. But you have to be very careful with this because you get a performance drop off very quickly. So a HEPA filter you can leave in there for 3 months or 6 months and then just change it and throw it away. If you use an electronic filter, it can be washed. It doesn't get thrown away. It allows a lot more air to pass through, but you have to have a monitor there because you have to know when to clean it. And that way you're able to balance health and energy savings and actual cost of operations at the same time. And you're doing it in a smart way that requires data. So I think that is kind of the future. That's what I'd love to see buildings all moving towards. And right now we've done a handful of them. And then you're able to really be green. You can be green health-wise as well as green in terms of energy and not adding more waste to the world. That's my Earth Day sort of hope.
Love it. That's great. Thank you, Louie. I'd like to ask a question that's kind of pie in the sky ideas for all three of you. If you could magically change one thing that would improve the air quality around you, what would it be?
I mean, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier and kind of just touch on that again, as I think there is a little bit of work that everyone could do and should do would be my answer. And that is really looking at the cycles or the patterns in your own life and really thinking about individual actions. You know, driving down the street, receiving that Amazon package on your doorstep. All of those things require tremendous amounts of energy. And as we said before, you know, the insidious thing about air pollution is you can't see it. Well, you can't see energy being consumed either. And that's the number one contributor to the problems that we're facing of a warming climate and, you know, increasing soil, water, and air pollution. It really is a kind of a collective effort. So I think if everyone had the awareness, and I think it is starting to go up, and our job as companies trying to do good can increase our education promotion and really designing the knowledge experience for consumers, that awareness will go up and it will start to have an impact. But you know, if I could magically change one thing, it would be to have everyone really do an inventory on their own consumption behaviors.
Yeah, good. That's really, really good. And the only thing I'd say, it's education and awareness. It starts with the individual, and if it doesn't start with the individual, it won't happen collectively. So if there's awareness of how you impact through your decisions on what you choose to wear, buy, do, that's the biggest single contributor to global air pollution. There are many people that cannot make those decisions. I think half of the air pollution mortality is through indoor cooking in the third world. Those people, there are many initiatives to remove or change the types of sources of energy to go to more cleaner energy for those people, which do not produce the particulates. It's not solving the energy issue because they're still consuming energy, but it's removing that particulates. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think the answer lies with the individual. Stop, think before we make any decision about what you buy, do, or where you go.
I'll take the flip side, which is at the government side. I think I've seen the individual. My whole business, my whole entity is all around individuals making choices, but there's still a fairly small piece to come to us and say, can you help us take care of my home, my office, my school? I'd rather flip it around and have the government put in the carrot or the stick, use market incentives. I'm from California. I don't waste water. It hurts me to hear a tap running unnecessarily, because it was drummed into me that if you have water on, my parents would say, do you know how much that costs? And that's what I would love the government to do more, is to establish market incentives, or it costs more to use energy, costs more to pollute. If you have a better environment, if you offer a building which offers healthier air, you get a incentive, and that leads people to do more things, and it leads people to care about measuring something, as opposed to in the early days. I remember I have a photo of a movie theater that has a small air purifier, a small portable that's sitting in the middle of the hall. That's what you have when you don't measure, and you have no incentive to measure.
Very great stuff. Thank you, everyone. We're kind of rounding out our discussion today, but I do want to give everybody the chance to add one additional thing that either you know from your experience that you wish every human being on the earth would know, or just one last thing you'd like to leave as we end this discussion on air pollution.
My PSA for everyone would be, as we now are kind of coming out of lockdown in a number of countries around the world, and we're all sort of like chomping at the bit to travel and get back out and see the world, really think about, when you get on that airplane, having a mask. It makes a qualitative difference to your health, but more importantly, it makes a real quantitative difference to public health. When we get together in small indoor spaces, it's a good idea to have a mask handy. You may not need to wear it, but you want to have one on you. And I think travel, especially air travel, is one area that we want to keep the surge and the reinfection rates down. That's one area that I'm very concerned about is air travel and for leisure and for work. But I would that's my PSA on Earth Day, is if you're going to travel, stay masked.
Nice one. Yeah, my one's pretty simple. Make sure you make an informed decision about what you buy, and if it's coming down to masking or an air filter, just think about what it does to the planet and think how it benefits you. Understand the function and look for a product that really works. If you can't breathe through it, you won't wear it properly, and it's a waste of money and time. That's pretty simple. Just be informed.
I would double down on what Nick just said. Be informed, but less from the sort of base education, and I would say bring it back to the data. There's lots of tech out there. It's lower and lower cost. So you yourself have technology. You have at the tips of your finger to measure the air around you on a real-time basis, and you should push that up, push it to your school, your church, wherever you spend time around. Once you have those numbers, then you know what's wrong. Why do you not feel good in a space? And then you can figure out the best way to deal with it, especially if you can do that in a responsible, effective way.
Great. Thank you all for this amazing information on air quality, air pollution. Thank you for being part of the first episode of On Air, our new webinar series from AirPop. And I look forward to seeing more from all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Bye.